Hello and welcome. We are continuing to read Ranger in Time, Night of Soldiers and Spies. This is Chapter 9, A Secret Plan. Chapter 9 Vocabulary. Number 1, fitful, often stopping and starting and not happening in a regular or continuous way. Number 2, whimpered, of a person or animal. Made a series of low, feeble sounds expressive of fear, pain, or discontent. Number 3, hesitated, paused before saying or doing something, especially through uncertainty. And number 4, fiercest, having or displaying an intense or ferocious aggressiveness, menacingly wild, savage, or hostile. If you open your books to page 61, we'll read Chapter 9, A Secret Plan. Isaac spent a fitful night on the floor of one of the Trenton homes the Hessians had taken over. Would they really let him walk away in the morning? Or did they suspect that he wasn't really a friend? Running off in the night would give him away as a spy for sure, so Isaac stayed, stroking Ranger's fur to calm himself. "Come on, dog," Isaac called when it was time to leave in the morning. His clothes had dried by the fire overnight. He changed into them, and he and Ranger began the long walk back to the river. The closer they got, the faster Isaac's heart beat as he thought about crossing again. It had been a cold night. The ice should be thicker now, but the memory of plunging into that frigid water was fresh in his bones. And what if the ice was gone completely? There was no hope of finding a boat. After General Washington had brought his men across from Trenton, he'd seized or burned every boat within 70 miles, so the Hessians couldn't follow them. When they reached the river, Isaac let out a long breath. It was frozen clear to the Pennsylvania shore, but his sense of relief didn't last. That meant he'd have to cross the thin ice again to return to Washington's camp. Ranger sniffed at the rocks on shore. He barked and pawed at Isaac's leg. "I know, dog." Isaac reached down to pat Ranger's head. "But we have a job to do." He reminded himself of the information he was bringing back to camp. He had to make it. If he didn't, everything he'd learned would be lost. Isaac took a careful step onto the river. It felt solid, but it had felt that way before. Ranger slid a paw onto the ice and whimpered. He didn't want to go on the frozen river again, but Isaac was crossing, and that meant Ranger had to cross too. Step by careful step, Isaac made his way across. Once, the ice beneath his feet let out a loud crack and a hiss. Isaac froze in his tracks, but the ice held, and soon he and Ranger were climbing the snowy bank on the far shore. When they arrived back at camp, Isaac had never felt so grateful to see the tents of the Continental Army. An officer hurried out to greet them. "Have you news from Trenton?" he asked. Isaac nodded, and the officer motioned for him to come inside a tent. "The general wishes to see you." "General Washington?" Isaac's eyes widened. He looked down at Ranger. "Stay, dog, stay." "No need for that. Bring him inside," a deep voice called from the tent. Isaac's breath caught in his throat. General Washington himself stood at the entrance. His height and wool cloak were unmistakable. He held the tent open and slapped his thigh. Ranger trotted up and sniffed General Washington's hand. He smelled like wood smoke and wet wool. Other dogs, too. Isaac followed Ranger into the tent. Half a dozen officers sat around a long wooden table covered in papers and maps. "Very well, then," said one of the officers, looking at Isaac. "What have you to report?" Isaac stood up straighter. "The Hessians have been watching the ice on the river," he said. He told them how he'd fallen through and ended up by Colonel Rawle's fire. He told them about the walk to Trenton, the long, windy stretches, the rutted road, and the ravines. "How many men are there?" an officer asked. "I'm not certain." Isaac thought about what he'd seen. "More than 1,000, but less than 2, I think." Washington nodded. "Is there anything more?" "I told Colonel Rawle that your army has no plans to move, that the men are hungry and weak and no longer following orders." Isaac hesitated. He wasn't sure if he should share the colonel's response. Colonel Rahl called our men country clowns. He said he'd been ordered to build fortifications but didn't, because he knew you wouldn't attack. They told me to observe your camp and return to them in 3 days with information. In 3 days. I believe that's when they plan to cross the river to attack us. Isaac felt the weight of what he'd just said. He'd gone into enemy territory as a spy and learned that the fiercest of all the troops fighting for King George were on their way to attack. Very well, General Washington said quietly. He looked at Isaac. Thank you for your courage, lad. This information is most helpful. He looked to his officers. We will meet for a council of war tonight. Then he turned back to Isaac. Not a word of this to anyone. Isaac knew he should leave, but he couldn't help asking, was my information truly useful? Will it help us prepare for the Hessians' attack? The Hessians will not be attacking, General Washington said. They won't? Isaac was confused. Didn't the officers believe him? They will not, the general said, because we are going to attack first. Chapter 9, Comprehension Questions. Number 1. What were 2 things that could have stood in the way of Isaac being able to get back to the Continental Army? Sample answer. The Hessians could have held him captive or executed him as a spy if they didn't believe his story. In addition, he could have fallen through the thin ice on the Delaware River on his way back to the Continental Army. Question 2. How do we know from this chapter that the Hessian Colonel Rahl doesn't have much respect for George Washington's troops? Sample answer. We know that the Hessian Colonel Rahl doesn't have much respect for George Washington's troops because he called them country clowns in front of Isaac. In addition, Colonel Rahl had been ordered to build fortifications around his camp in Trenton, but he refused to do so because he believed Washington's troops wouldn't attack. Question 3. In what ways was the information Isaac gave to George Washington about his journey to and from the Hessians' camp likely useful to this American general? Sample answer. The information that Isaac gave to George Washington about his journey to and from the Hessians' camp in Trenton was likely useful to the American general because it gave him an idea of how much time and effort it would take to get American troops to Trenton to pull off an attack. And in war, timing really matters. And this takes us to Chapter 10.